How is ritual important to the safe and proper use of entheogens? How does ritual help facilitate a deeper entheogenic experience? What is 5-MeO-DMT, and why is it so seldom discussed in entheogenic studies? And what is Toad? Today I interview Hal Lucius Nation, the Grand Archbishop of the Temple of Awakening Divinity, or Toad. 5-MeO-DMT, or 5-methoxy-N-dimethyltryptamine, is probably the most powerful of all entheogens and is not a Schedule I narcotic. Simultaneously, it is one of the least studied and discussed of all entheogens today. Like its cousin, NN-DMT, 5-MeO-DMT is a natural neurotransmitter found in all mammalian brains. In this interview, I'll be looking into the use of ritual, as well as the ritualistic use of 5-MeO-DMT, and discussing some of the practices of the Temple of Awakening Divinity. And here is my interview with Lucius Nation. Enjoy. All right, Lucius Nation, welcome to Gnostic Media Research and Publishing's podcast 35.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Jan. It's a pleasure to be here and really privileged to be on your show.
Well, you know, I've got to admit, you know, a lot of people that are listening to this show are first going to think, you know, what the heck is Jan doing? This is a really weird interview compared to what I usually have on, number one. And number two, I know there are going to be people out in the audience who are automatically going to say, you know, Aliester Crowley, wasn't he a devil worshiper? You know, and I want to ask you from there, was he a devil worshiper, or was his work misunderstood? Let me add to that a lot of people are going to say that since your work incorporates Aliester Crowley's work in some way, or Thelema, whatever, however you want to incorporate it, that you must be a part of some satanic cult, or you're a heretic, or something to that effect. So what do you have to say to those points?
Well, there's a number of questions there. The first thing I would say is that Aliester Crowley was definitely misunderstood and continues to be misunderstood. Some of that is based on his own intentional misperceptions that he liked to throw out about himself. Secondarily, I would say that Aliester Crowley was a researcher into various forms of religious and ontological practice and ritual forms. So at one time or another, Crowley was a Christian, was raised as a devout Christian, a member of the Plymouth Brethren. At another point in his life, he firmly rejected Christianity. I don't think he ever rejected the inner teachings of Christianity, and
the esoteric teachings.
I would definitely have to say that would be accurate. I think what he rejected were the exoteric and rather hypocritical aspects of fundamentalist forms of Christianity.
I would have to agree with that myself, I think.
But at one time or another, he, was a spiritual practitioner of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hermeticism. He has a couple of rituals that utilize forms that include archetypes that could be considered satanic, whatever that might mean. So the idea here is that, yes, his work is greatly misunderstood, but he was probably one of the most experienced researchers into the spiritual phenomenon within the context of the 20th century. So for people who might think that what I am doing is satanic in any way, I would really invite them to come and sit in my circle and see what it is that I do, and then see if they still have that feeling. One thing that I would say, the work that I'm doing is quite heretical in that I believe and feel strongly that people can have a direct experience of the divine and don't need any kind of formalized religious structure to get there. That they can just have it.
So what you're saying is that basically, even though you've studied all of this stuff, as did Crowley and everything, basically what you're doing is throwing all of that out and showing people how they can have their own direct experience without any form of dogma.
Yes and no. The fundamental idea of religion is based on the Latin religere, right? Ligature, to reconnect. So that posits a presupposition that we are somehow disconnected from the divine or source, and then need these specific forms that have been created in order to reconnect. I believe that that's a fundamental misconception. I believe that we are all intimately connected with the divine all the time. And the only thing that keeps us from realizing that is our own limited perspective, meaning that our egoic consciousness, which we exist in our normal states as humans, veils, and it's a very, very thin veil, what lies beneath that. And that is our absolute intimate connection with the divine. So does that mean we need to throw out all of these dogmatic constructs? Yes, if they keep us from that realization. Now I want to take that back because there's some caveats. The caveats are these structured forms that we call, our various exoteric religions, they all have a basis in this direct spiritual experience. In fact, I will actually hold that any mystical experience, and this is pretty bold theory, any spiritual experience that anyone has ever had throughout time, including all of the great sages and teachers and sadhus and avatars and god-men, whatever we'd like to call them, had that experience because of a chemical reaction in their brains that opened them up to the divine. Now that could have happened either exogenously, meaning they took it in from some outside source, or it happened endogenously, meaning that they participated in some form of practice that opened up and allowed their pineal to release this particular molecule into their brains that allowed them to have this experience. So that's a pretty bold stance that I'm taking on that. And I will, I invite anybody to bring any kind of refutation of that forward. Now, then people will say, well, that's kind of reductionist. You're reducing all spiritual experience to this, you're saying this chemical is the spiritual experience. I'm not, because the chemical is merely a key. And what the spiritual experience is, which is a subjective experience, involves the interrelation between our personal consciousness, which then the molecule provides a key into a particular receptor site, which is designed to receive that molecule, that then opens up this doorway into direct communion with the divine, which is in us anyways. So what I'm saying is, and what could be considered very heretical, is that we do not of necessity need these religious forms and frameworks that presently exist. However, many of them are so beautiful and such expressions of beauty and love in a particular cultural context, that to not utilize them, to not use the traditions of the ancient Greeks or the traditions of the Sufis or the traditions of the Kabbalists would be a massive waste. And these traditions help us inform our global context for our connection with Source throughout a vast history. So they're all incredibly beautiful, but when they're utilized to create separation and to create the wars that we see raging across our planet, they are not useful to us. and so they would need to be abandoned if they indeed create separation.